Good morning, everyone, and welcome into week 5 of the Bible in 90 days. I hope you're enjoying your reading and continuing to progress through the Old Testament, perhaps with a consistent pattern or routine every day you might be settling into. Remember, if you're continuing to struggle to get through the readings, try to mix it up a little bit. Maybe try reading from Eugene Peterson's The Message for a while, or maybe try switching over to an audio a recording of the Bible and going on a walk as you listen to the day's readings. For some people, a good routine works really well, and for other people, mixing it up can be helpful too. A change of pace can go a long way. So I would encourage you to feel free to experiment a little bit as you try to determine the best way to continue to progress your way through the Old Testament. The good news is this week we will reach the halfway point of the Old Testament, so congratulations on that. And we find ourselves this week in the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah. So those are the 4 books that we will have a look at today. 1st and 2nd Chronicles comes together about 150 years after the people have returned from exile in Babylon. So if you recall the ending of 2nd Kings, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon comes and destroys the walls of Jerusalem and the temple in Jerusalem and ships the vast majority of people off into exile in Babylon. They return when Cyrus, king of Persia, conquers Babylon and gives the former exiles the freedom to come back to their homeland. And the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles are written during this time period. But the events described in them are the same events that are described in the books of Samuel and Kings. It's a retelling of those books in the books of Chronicles. Ezra and Nehemiah will tell about the events that are happening as the people return from exile in Babylon. So, both Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah are written in the post-exilic period, that is, in the period after the people have returned from exile in Babylon. They're all written in that period, but 1st and 2nd Chronicles records events that happened prior to the exile and leading up to the exile, the same events told in 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, while Ezra and Nehemiah describe the events happening at that time in the post-exile as the people seek to reestablish themselves in the land. So, the chronicler then, the author of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which by the way is really just one book, it was just too long to fit on one scroll, so it ended up as 1st and 2nd Chronicles because you needed 2 scrolls to hold the book of Chronicles. This author is writing about 600 years after the reign of King David. So, although he's describing the life of David and his accomplishments, he's writing much, much, much later at a time when the people still did not have a king, because although they were able to return to Jerusalem, they could only have regional governors. Their king was still the king of Persia. The chronicler then is retelling the same events that we read about in Samuel and Kings. And you may be thinking to yourself, oh no, do I have to read through all of that history again? In the New Testament, of course, there are 4 Gospels that all detail the life of Christ. So I know you won't be complaining then once we're finally into the Gospels. So hopefully just reading the narrative of David down to the exile again won't be too difficult. In many ways, the narrative covers the same events, but in other ways it describes those events from a very different perspective. The chronicler takes a much more spiritual perspective to this history that's described in the books. Samuel and Kings take a much more political focus, whereas, as you'll see in Chronicles, the focus is much more spiritual. From the perspective of the author of Chronicles, spiritual righteousness, right standing with God, must be set in place first. And if that is set in place, then political success and autonomy will follow. So there's a huge emphasis in Chronicles on the role of the priests and the Levites, the activities in the temple, these spiritual components to life that are much more important at the time the chronicler is writing, when they have no king. Whereas at the times of Samuel and Kings, the emphasis is much more on the actions and the wars and the politics of the various kings. Another difference between these books is that the authors of Samuel and Kings clearly have a perspective on the events that they're describing that really leads you to a place of doom and despair. They're writing at a time when the exile is fresh and present, and they're trying to make sense of everything that's happened. But Chronicles, the authors are writing with a much more solid sense of expectation and hope that the future is going to be bright. This is a palpable difference that you'll feel when you read through these narratives. It seems that the chronicler has gained a lot more perspective on the exile itself and the events that led up to them. The chronicler has been combing through the histories that were recorded in Samuel and Kings, which the chronicler presumably had as a source. And the chronicler has looked for patterns, recognizable reasons why the things described in those books happened the way that they did. The patterns that they identify are simply that the unfaithful kings received judgment from God that was their due for their unjust actions. But when there were faithful kings who did the right thing, when the people obeyed the law, when people listened to God, God did wonderful things for them. And so the chronicler writes with the optimism that if in this post-exilic period the people can do the right thing, then indeed God will be wonderful to them as well. The chronicler seems to have access also to the Pentateuch in its final form. The Pentateuch being the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the books of the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In Samuel and Kings, it seems as though Deuteronomy is really the only book of Torah that the author there is drawing on, but the author of Chronicles seems to have access to a wider range of documents, and there are some allusions in these books to older Old Testament books that we've read already. So I hope you'll pick up on some of those, and I hope that that will be an exciting thing for you. Another feature that's characteristic of Chronicles, again sticking with this very spiritual perspective, is there's much more of an emphasis on prayer in these books. For example, in 1 Chronicles 16, there's this beautiful medley of lines from various psalms. The Psalter is also in some of its preliminary stages at this point, and so the author has a lot of access to psalmic material, and we'll see a lot of that quoted in Chronicles. In 1 Chronicles 29, we read about King David's farewell prayer and benediction to the people, another beautiful little liturgical component in this very temple-centric book. You might be thinking, well, how can Chronicles rewrite history? And who got it right? The Deuteronomist, who is the author of Samuel and Kings, or the chronicler, the author of 1st and 2nd Chronicles? Who got it right? But from the perspective of the biblical authors, and particularly the perspective of the chronicler, history is really more than just recalling events. It's more about the perspective that the people have on those events, the meaning that emerges from those events. And so the chronicler has a certain perspective, just as the Deuteronomist has a certain perspective. The perspective of the chronicler is very God-focused. Samuel and Kings are not always that way, really. But for the chronicler, everything is very God-focused. The author of Chronicles is trying to trace what God is doing as the history of this people of Israel continues to unfold. So for the chronicler, the sort of eyewitness history of events is pretty far removed, but that's less important than the sort of prophetic explanation of those events as it pertains to what God is doing through them. We might also say that Samuel and Kings is a history looking back, while Chronicles is a history looking forward. That is to say, all of the doom and gloom that we saw in Samuel and Kings is a little bit less prominent in Chronicles, Instead, Chronicles spells out all the good things that can happen when the people are faithful. For example, in Chronicles, a great deal of material is added during to the description of the reigns of the good kings, particularly King Hezekiah and King Josiah. These are kings who are remembered positively in Samuel and Kings, but especially in Chronicles, their goodness is highlighted by their faithfulness to the national worship life of the people. These two kings especially are described as celebrating in great detail the festival of Passover, which grew in prominence in this post-exilic period. So Chronicles is a history looking forward to what the religious and spiritual life of the people can be as they reestablish themselves back in Jerusalem. So let's take a look at a brief outline of the book of Chronicles. The first 9 chapters are a bit of a doozy. I'm going to just warn you now. You've made some comments already about these long genealogies you find in one chapter or another, but the first 9 chapters of Chronicles are more or less one long genealogy. And it may look kind of tedious from the outside looking in because they go all the way back to Adam, and they recount as many ancestors as they had on record at the time. But this genealogy is incredibly important to the authors at this time for a number of reasons. There's a strong sense of the ideas of continuity and of identity with God's covenant people as the chronicler is writing. Because he's writing at a time when God's covenant with the people is a little bit in question, as the people are still reeling from the years of exile and wondering what life will be like back in their homeland. The genealogies also serve to remind the people that they've survived a lot over these years. They survived the Assyrians, they survived the Babylonians, and so surely, despite their present hardships, this is a nitty-gritty people whose God continues to provide for them, even through thick and thin. In chapter 3 of Chronicles, in the midst of these genealogies, we see the list of David's descendants, and not only those who were kings and who sat on the Davidic throne, but also his other descendants as well. And this is clearly an indication of the continuing importance of the Davidic line, even in these post-exilic years, as many people sort of looked to see if a Davidic king would eventually emerge, and with him, Israel's independence and a Davidic king on the throne once more. 1 Chronicles 10 through 2 Chronicles 9 describes the reigns of David and Solomon again. Of course, these two most prominent kings in the history of Israel. And their major focus there is on the construction of the temple, which happens under King Solomon, but is sort of prepared for throughout the reign of King David. In Chronicles, David and Solomon are not depicted as the military heroes that they were in Samuel and Kings, but rather they are the sort of religious leaders who establish faithful worship in the temple. So there's a very cultic emphasis on David and Solomon that we get in Chronicles that we didn't really see in Kings. The Psalms also play a major role in Chronicles, and it's here that David's musical gifts are more on display than they were in Samuel. The cultic singers have a solid place in the worship life in the temple, and again, the Psalms are starting to emerge at this time. So these temple singers are very important, and in fact, they're even referred to as prophets or seers at certain points in this narrative. So it's a very prominent time for them as well. David is cleaned up a little bit in this book. The Bathsheba narrative is not present in Chronicles, nor is the revolt of Absalom. Instead, David is this sort of prototype of absolute piety and holiness. And the same is true of Solomon. Solomon is presented in Chronicles almost exactly as he was presented in 1 Kings 1 through 11. The only thing that's taken out is his idol worship. In 1 Kings 11, at the end of Solomon's life, he falls prey to idol worship. His heart is led astray. We don't see that in Chronicles. Instead, in Chronicles, we see the Solomon who became later associated so strongly with the quality of wisdom. We see the wise king who is able to do the right thing, and so Solomon emerges as the sort of paragorn of wisdom. In 2 Chronicles 10 through 36, we read about the reigns of all of the subsequent kings. The chronicler pays very little attention to the northern kings. He's much more concerned with the kings in the south. As you read through the book of 2 Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, there was a lot of alternating between the kings in the north, the kings in the south, the evil things they did, and so on. But Chronicles focuses very much on the kings in the south. Particularly, he pays a lot of attention to his favored tribes, the tribes of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin, and the tribe of Levi, of course, the Levites being a major player in temple life at the time of the chronicler. And so the order of events follows very closely the order that we find in the book of Kings, but certain stories are expanded to highlight the positive characteristics and successes of these kings. Earlier I mentioned the good kings like Josiah and Hezekiah and their careful observance of the Passover, but we see some similar expansion in the stories of kings like Asa and Jehoshaphat and so on, these kings who have positive recollection in general. The chronicler really seems to elaborate on that in a lot of ways. Even certain evil kings are given a sort of positive spin. Manasseh, for example, is one of the most evil kings in Samuel and Kings. And in fact, the Babylonian exile, to a large extent, is attributed to him as punishment for his sins 50 years prior. He still does horrible things in the chronicler's account, but upon going into exile, he repents and is forgiven by God and is able to return to the land. And so Manasseh becomes a sort of prototype for the people as a whole, who are able to return to the land despite their sins because God is gracious. The book of Chronicles ends with a very hopeful note. It describes how Cyrus, king of Persia, decrees that the people are to return to Jerusalem and build a temple there to the God of heaven. And so the book ends on this very hopeful note of the people returning from exile and being able to reestablish themselves back in Jerusalem. By the way, Judah is now referred to as Yehud, same area but a different name that we find in these books of Chronicles. So again, much more emphasis on the temple and its life in the book of Chronicles than we found in 1st and 2nd Samuel. Much more emphasis on the good kings and the things that they did well. Also, God acts a lot more through mediators in Chronicles. He acts more directly in the books of Samuel and Kings, but more through mediators, through angels and the like in the book of Chronicles. And again, as I mentioned before, much more of an emphasis on prayer and spiritual well-being that we find in the books of Chronicles. Okay, so after Chronicles we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, which are also really just one book split down into two parts. Ezra and Nehemiah records events that happen upon the return from exile, and so it follows naturally after Chronicles, which ends on that very hopeful note as the people are in the process of returning from exile. In here we find the decrees of the Persian kings, as well as the narratives about the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem and the rebuilding of Jerusalem's city walls. The temple was rebuilt and completed in the year 515, and so we begin the so-called Second Temple period. This will be the same temple that Christ will go to eventually. It'll be expanded in the time of King Herod, but now this Second Temple period has begun and will carry on all the way until after Christ's death and resurrection in the year 70. Ezra and Nehemiah are sort of the two primary leaders in this post-exilic period. Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra takes responsibility for restoring the law and its observance among the people. After all, he's a descendant of Aaron, and so his connection with the Mosaic law makes sense. Nehemiah takes responsibility for rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And after all, he had been an official in the high court of Persia. So he's good at this sort of thing. So the two of them together emerge as the leaders in this time period. Ezra as the priest or the leader, the lead teacher, and Nehemiah as the lead political leader. And together they rebuild the temple and the city walls. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah also seek to explain how God is instrumental in restoring the people from their exile in Babylon. God uses the Persians to allow the people to return, and the Persians even give them money to rebuild the temple. They actually finance this. And so from the perspective of the authors of Ezra and Nehemiah, God is working through the Persians to bless the people of Israel. And so there is a very hopeful future as they return to the land. Quick overview of the structure of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra 1 through 6 records the first events that take place after returning to Judah, which, as I mentioned before, is now called Yehud. Ezra 7 to 10 contains biographical information about Ezra himself. Nehemiah 1 through 7, it's a sort of diary or memoir from the perspective of Nehemiah. And then Nehemiah 8 to 10 records certain reforms that Ezra puts in place during this time. Nehemiah 11 through 12 contains assorted notes on Nehemiah and other pertinent players during this time period. Finally, Nehemiah 13 wraps up with some information about Nehemiah's second term as governor. So that'll take us through the books of Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah in this coming week. Overall, together, Ezra and Nehemiah describe life at a very critical moment in the history of Israel as they begin to rebuild and reestablish their political and religious life upon returning to Jerusalem and emerging from the Babylonian exile. And the book of Chronicles recasts the history of the people in a positive and hopeful light, giving the assurance that insofar as the people are spiritually faithful in their worship of God, then surely God will act to bless them, as God has always done when people were faithful in the past. So, I hope that's a helpful introduction to you to these books of Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah. These books are very, very rare in the lectionary. We almost never hear them preached in church, so you may have never even heard of these books before. So take the time to read them carefully. I know many of the events will be familiar from what you've just read in Samuel and Kings, but they do have a unique story to tell, a unique place in the canon, and a unique perspective on the history of Israel that I hope you will find insightful as we continue to move into the second half of the Old Testament. So keep up the great work, enjoy your reading this week, and may God bless you and keep you always. Thanks for joining me today.